Hey everybody, welcome to my studio tour 2018 edition. I did one of these back, I think in 2014 or 2015 or something like that. I've changed a lot of things in my studio since then, and I figured I'd show you guys around. So one of the first things you'll notice is that this is a brand new space. I moved here, I think in 2015. One of my main goals with building this studio was to be able to work as fast as possible. So everything in this room is set up properly. It's all plugged in, all the MIDI is going to the right place. It's all in service of getting the track down as fast as possible. The last thing I want to be doing when I have an idea is worry about MIDI routing or why something isn't working. So basically I have an input set for almost every single instrument in this room. He hates being picked up. So I guess to start, one of the main things that people ask me is like, what DAW do I use? So I use Ableton Live 10 now. As far as plugins, I use a wide variety of stuff, mainly UAD for mixing, although I've gotten more recently into Goodhertz. They make this amazing compressor called the Wolf compressor, which you'll probably know from Wolfpack. A lot of Sound Toys plugins like Echo Boy and other stuff like that. So guitar is my main instrument. It's what I grew up playing. It's what I feel more comfortable with. It's probably the closest thing that I can get to translating whatever's going on in my head onto like an instrument or the physical world. So if I hear a melody in my head, I can very quickly pick it up on a guitar. So to continue with this ethos of making things as easy as possible, I have a guitar setup, which is, I have right now 3 different guitar amps, the main one being the Fender Reverb Deluxe in head form, the Jazz Chorus 120H, which is actually quite rare. I'm also using the Vox AC4, which is a very small little amp. I think you can get it for maybe $200, $300 or something like that. It's pretty amazing for how cheap it is. And I have all of this running into an ISO cab. So this is basically a cabinet that isolates, loud noises. So, especially for somebody like me that lives in an apartment, it's pretty important not to annoy my neighbors. So I'm using this Ampeg system selector where you can basically pick a different amp and send it out to the same speaker. So I just kind of flip a switch and changed a different amp depending on what I'm looking for. The Fender is kind of bright and brittle. It's good for a specific type of sound. The Jazz Chorus is just 80s. I mean, when you're looking for like really chunky kind of rhythm guitar, it's amazing, especially with the chorus effect on that. The Vox AC4 is just my go-to guitar sound. It's like clean. It has a very kind of warm Vox sound that I really like. Just a little bit of breakup where I need it. And most importantly, it's very quiet. So I can run it at 0.4 amps actually, or 0.4 watts. And that means I can drive it pretty hard and the sound is, you can't even hear it. Right now I have my pedals off of our touring rig. This is something that I usually use, when we're on the road, but, I haven't been touring a ton lately, so I brought it home to kind of mess around with it and try different things. It's pretty standard. I mean, there's a basic tuner, a phaser, a chorus. This chorus is actually pretty interesting. It's I think it's like 1982, 83, something like that, and it just sounds like the 80s. I mean, I haven't really found another pedal that replicates that sound so well. I'm also using an old school Boss compressor, made in Japan, of course. The Moke delay is quite nice. I really like it. I'm also using a Holy Grail, and for some overdrive, I'm using the Full Tone OCD. I also have a side rack over here that houses a lot of my pedals that basically don't travel. So they're just kind of there and available for me to try out and mess around with. As far as guitars go, I mostly use my Gibson SG Special, which is my childhood guitar. It's something I've had for a really long time. I use that on pretty much everything. I'm just very comfortable with it. I do have a couple other guitars that I use from time to time. I have a Thinline Telly, which used to be a backup guitar for touring, but again, don't really need it, so brought it home. As far as bass guitar goes, I actually use a Fender Jazz bass most of the time, just straight in to either a preamp. Maybe I'll use a 2-bass preamp just to kind of get a little something. Moving over to some of the drum machines, I have a Arturia drum brute, which I just got recently. I really like it, actually. I don't even really use the internal sequencer a lot. I'll just plug it into Ableton, and then I can just manually trigger each sample or each, drum hit from there. So it's actually really easy to program in a software-based system. And next up, we get the Roland TR-808, absolute legend. This was actually given to me by my friend Martin, so shout out to Martin. It's actually really annoying to sync up with Ableton, so what I've done is mostly sample it, or like if there's like a specific rhythm or something that I'm looking for, I'll record it and then kind of sample, chop it up and move it around. Next up, we have the Korg Volca Beats. I got this because it's just super cheap, and I don't know, it's a fun little toy. I can't say I use it a lot. I do have it plugged in over MIDI, similar to the drum brute, for the same reasons, because then I can just control each individual hit and try some different stuff. But it's mostly a toy at this point. I might as well talk about some of the other Korg Volca stuff. So we have the Korg Volca Bass, which is similar, same family of products. I can't say I use it a lot. Again, cheap, fun little toy. It's fun to actually all connect them together because they're all battery powered and just jam that way. But I wouldn't say it's a very useful tool for like the studio. On that level, I have the Korg Volca FM. The Volca FM is actually a little more interesting because it seems to be a similar FM engine as like the DX7 and other synths like that. And it sounds great. It sounds really cool. It's like that crispy digital sound that you just can't get from certain analog gear. And of course, when we're talking about FM synthesis, I have to mention the DX100. I don't really know a whole lot of the history of it. I know that it's basically a slimmed down version of the DX7, which I have over here. This family of synthesizers, they're different in the sense that they use FM synthesis, which is very different than the more traditional kind of analog subtractive synthesis. There's a lot of videos on YouTube about this. If you want to do a deep dive, this isn't really the right time. But yeah, basically it uses this kind of additive way of creating sound, and it was a breakthrough, back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it created a lot of these almost laughable sounds now, but at the time they're quite realistic. And you can hear the DX7 and the DX100, that whole family, you can hear it everywhere. It's on pretty much, it's on most of the major records in the 80s and 90s, and probably even still to this day. It's pretty easy to find these on like Reverb or eBay or whatever, and I think I got mine for maybe $100, so it's a pretty affordable way to get into this kind of stuff. So moving over to the modular synths, this is probably a video in of itself, but modular synthesis is a way of separating all the different elements of a synthesizer and letting you pick and choose whatever you prefer. And there's so many different manufacturers, ranging like very well established companies to like people in their garage making stuff. And it's such a cool community of creators and really inventive and smart people. I can't say that it's the most useful tool in the studio, especially it's not the quickest thing. Whenever I'm bored with the sound, or if I can't seem to get something interesting, I'll always go there and I'll always get something really cool. You pick and choose your favorite parts, right? So at the top, I have my oscillators. After that, I have my filters. Then on the third row, it goes into more, kind of utility. So there's ADSRs, there's VCAs. So some of these filters are actually pretty interesting. So the post-lawsuit filter, I believe this is, don't quote me on this, but what I heard was it's basically a clone of the ARP 2600, and at some point in time, whoever owns that sued them, and they had to change their name. I also have the Frequency Steiner, which is based on the Steiner filter. It's a very unique, kind of sharp filter, which I really like for certain things. Also the CS80 filter, which if you know the original Blade Runner soundtrack, that's it. I can't afford the, what is it, like 20 grand for the CS80, so I'm stuck with the filter. And some of the other rows have just, different sets of effects. I like Make Noise a lot. They make some really great stuff. Maths, that's a whole nother can of worms. The Vulcan modulator, how can you not love this stuff? And then on this bottom rack, I have a bunch of drum stuff. So each one of these modules is basically like, you know, like an 808 kick or a 909 snare. You can kind of pick and choose what you like, and then you can trigger those using, you know, a sequencer of some sort. And then the very bottom rack is basically just stuff that I haven't quite fit in the rest of the rack. So that's the other side of this stuff. For fun, I build these. You can buy kits, and you know, I don't really have a whole lot of electronics expertise, but you know, I enjoy building them. I recently got this Arturia BeatStep Pro as well, which I really like. It integrates really well with modular gear. And next up, we have the Roland Juno 60, which is my all-time favorite synth. It also happened to be the first synth I ever bought, so I think I've used it on pretty much every song I've ever put out. It's pretty rare that I don't use it. I really like it. It's just very intuitive, and I think above all else, I just know it. And I think that's one of the most overlooked things in synthesizers, is that sometimes people, you know, look at the price tag or look at this artist that used this and that, but really one of the most important things, I think, is, you know, your ability to know how to use it properly. Because, you know, if it's well-rounded and you understand what you're doing, you can do anything with just one synth. So in order to connect the Juno 60 to the computer, I actually need this thing called the MD8, which is an adapter. It converts DCV, which is like a precursor to MIDI, converts it to MIDI, and this way I can use my computer. I can basically program it, and I don't really have to play it. I'm not even really much of a player, actually. I always prefer to program things on the computer. With that said, one of my favorite things about this system is that I can program the melody on the computer and then basically play the faders as I'm recording it. So it creates this more nuanced approach where you're not so worried about like timing and hitting the right notes. You're more focusing on the overall tone of the sound. And especially if you do it in groups and you can kind of layer things, you can create some really interesting stuff. And next up I have a bunch of these Roland boxes. I got these recently. They're basically reissues of older synthesizers. They're a little bit more limited, and I was talking about the Steiner filter earlier. It's present here in this Arturia Micro Brute. So I also have the Korg MS-10, not to be confused with the MS-20. It's basically the one oscillator version, which is a synth I've also had for a very long time. I think this version was originally made in 1971, 72, something like that. And it's starting to show its age a little bit, but it has such a unique character, and it's really irreplaceable in my studio. It's such a big part of my sound, and like once you hear it, I think you start to pick it out everywhere. What I really like about it is just its simplicity. It's one oscillator, a filter, and an envelope generator, and that's pretty much it. But with that said, the filter is so unique and it's such an interesting resonance curve that, I don't know, there's so many things you can do with it. If you set it to pulse width modulation, you can actually basically phase out the oscillator and only play with the filter resonance, which is kind of cool. So as far as audio equipment goes, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but basically my main sound cards are Universal Audio Apollo series. I've been using them since I think 2011, 2012, something like that. I really like it. The UAD system just works. It alleviates a lot of processing power from my CPU, so it allows me to add even more plugins on top of all of the tracks that I do. So I have an Apollo 8, which I think is the original. Then I have the two Apollo 16s, which is kind of overkill, but I basically did some commercial work for them and they hooked me up, so I can't complain. I'm using a lot of Universal Audio stuff, actually. So that's the sound card side of it, and I basically have a variety of different inputs and different types of preamps, and I wanted to have as much flavor as possible. So let's see, up top in the 500 series rack, which is a new format that I actually really like. So I have the Chandler TG2500, a 1073 clone, which is, not original, but it's probably the closest thing I can get to an original in 500 series format. So this Shadow Hills Dual Vandergraaf is actually my go-to compressor for drums. I run all my drums through it on every track, for the past probably 6 years. The API 512C is actually what I'm recording these vocals through. I think it's a great clean preamp. I really like it. Then I have a bunch of DBX 580s. I got these to kind of fill out the rack. They're pretty cheap too. I have a tube-based Universal Audio 2610, which is basically two, well, like the name implies, two 610s with an added EQ and DI. And of course I have a regular 610, which I really like. The Blackline Auteur is another preamp I've had for a while. It's pretty clean. There's nothing really specific about it. It works. In terms of audio processing, sometimes I'll send tracks out of Ableton into hardware and then back in real time. It adds a little bit of latency, but it's worth it. Next up is the Alesis 3630 compressor. This is the Daft Punk compressor. It does that one thing, and it does it very well. And they're very cheap. I think you can get them for 30 or 40 bucks on eBay. So I got two of them. So the next two devices are part of my two bus chain, which is basically the master chain. So this is something that I put on the overall track. So I'm using the Clariphonic, which is a parallel EQ. So it takes the high end, and basically just kind of like mixes a high end signal, a boosted high end signal back into it. It's a cleaner way of doing things instead of just like straight up boosting a signal. And I think what I like about it is that there's no numbers on it. I mean, just the fact that it says focus and clarity with no numbers, just a dial, it's inviting you to dial it in using your ears as opposed to being, scientific about it. One of the main things of my master chain is the API 2500. It's an amazing compressor. I don't even run this too hard, actually. It's just hitting the needle just slightly. I'm also using a couple outboard effects. This is just something I always have plugged in, and it's just always ready on a return channel in Ableton, so I can just send stuff to it anytime. So I have the Eventide Black Hole, which is actually a guitar pedal, but it's stereo, it sounds great, and I use it as a return bus. I'm also using the Boss DD20, which is essentially a guitar pedal as well, but I'm running it as a return channel. So as I mentioned, it's really important to me to keep things moving quickly. So I have a bunch of synths basically as close as possible to my desk and just ready to go, always plugged in. And some of my favorites are just monophonic synths. So because of that, I have a Korg Monologue, which is a pretty new synth actually, but I see it as sort of a spiritual successor to the MS-10, sort of like the new version of it in some ways. And I really like it. It's pretty easy. It has a pretty cool sequencer, which is good to have options. Also have the JP-08. I actually used to use a real Jupiter 8, but I was only borrowing it because those are crazy expensive. So it's nice to have the digital cheap version. And moving on to the Mini Moke Voyager XL. I got this one a couple years ago. I wish I actually used it more. It's absolutely amazing on bass. I mean, that's what they're known for. The filter is unbelievable. You can have 3 oscillators, and you also have this side panel, which I really like, so I can actually patch it into my modular gear and run things that way, although I don't really do that very often. I'd say that if you're gonna get one of these, I'd probably go for, the regular model, or maybe actually get one of the new reissues. I heard they're really cool. Another interesting synth that I have is the Univac Mini Korg. I don't know a whole lot about the history of this synth, but I know that it's somewhat rare, and that the versions that you find on eBay are actually the 2 oscillator versions. So this is somewhat unique, and you can tell that this is sort of the beginning of a lot of synthesizer history, because a lot of the names that they chose, for example, like Traveler instead of Filter, or Expand, Bright, Sustain, Bender. These are all odd names. It seems like things weren't hashed out by then. And moving on to electric keys, I have a few. So I'm using primarily the Yamaha CP70 as a piano sound when I'm not using virtual synths. I really like it. It has a very distinct sound. It has a great sound for what it is, but if you're looking for that traditional piano sound, that's not the place to go. It was used as a touring piano in the 70s, and it's really not that great for that actually. It weighs like 300 pounds, and yeah, but it looks cool, and I don't know, it's fun to play. It's actually a great writing tool, because it's not very loud either. Also, I have a Wurlitzer 200E. It's a little bit beat up, but it's an absolutely amazing keyboard. I don't know, I feel like you can't play any wrong notes on it. It just flows. It's like butter or something. I can't describe it. It's so warm and nice, or when you use the tremolo on it, it's amazing. I love it. Moving on to the Rhodes 54. This is actually a pretty rare keyboard. Apparently this specific model is very hard to find. I just kind of got lucky, I guess. I also have a bunch of these pocket operators. I really do like them. I wish they were more useful though. I'm also using the Teenager Engineering OP1 as a MIDI controller more than a synthesizer actually. I mean, I'll use it from time to time for sounds, or if I'm looking for like a drum beat, or I can like kind of play it out on the built-in samples, but I really like it as a MIDI controller, and I've set up my Ableton session to integrate with it, and I can control all kinds of interesting things with it. Hey everyone, just wanted to say thanks for tuning in. This is a bit of a deep dive, and for those of you that stuck through the end, I appreciate you. Thank you. I'll see you next time.